Okay, so welcome to a series of presentations that CMHA is doing in partnership with GMB. And today we're going to be actually talking about addictions and trying to give you some really foundational information about addictions and hopefully give you a better understanding of some of the key factors, contributors, and all those sorts of things. If you have any questions at any time, there is a Q&A button that I would encourage you to use. At the end of the presentation, I'll go to the Q&As and work through those. You can also use the chat function to chat with everybody. I just don't promise that I'll catch every single question if the chat's moving quite quickly. So if you've got a question, if you want to send it over to the Q&A, that's awesome. All right. Okay. So first and foremost, we start every presentation with a little bit of an introduction as to who CMHA is. For those of you who may have been with me in presentations previously in the Fredericton region, you know, you're familiar, but I'm going to go through it anyways, just in case we have any new folks hanging out. So CMHA was founded in 1918. We're one of the oldest nonprofits in Canada. We're 102 years old, as you can tell by the math. And realistically, as a province, we kind of see our mandate as trying to build access to community resources, to build mental health literacy, and build resiliency in folks and in New Brunswickers province-wide. We also look to support folks who are living with mental health problems to get access to the best resources available. Here in New Brunswick, we have 18 locations provincially. Now, right now, our offices are closed for COVID, and we're all working from home. However, there is staff still in every single region of the province that you can reach out to locally if that's the case. And if you're curious about what staff are located in what regions, you can check out our website or you can ask in the chat, and I'm sure one of my moderators would be happy to help you out as well. We do have the Certified Provincial Peer Support Program and an employment program down in Charlotte County as well. So if you have questions about either of those, feel free to ask them, and we can always chat about that either in the Zoom, or we can do it offline through email or that sort of stuff. Any burning questions about CMHA before I continue? Have I piqued anyone's curiosity with us as an organization? All right. Don't say I didn't give you a chance. All right. So we start off this presentation with statistics. And I know statistics aren't always the most exciting thing for folks, but what they are really good for is helping us build some context for you, helping you gain some sort of perspective about the issue that we're going to talk about for the next 50 minutes. Okay. So let's start with this. Okay. 21% of Canadians, which depending on the population comes out to about 6 million people, will meet the criteria for some form of addiction in their lives. So that's about a fifth of Canadians. In terms of, you know, hospitalizations, when we look at addictions, of all the hospitalizations in Canada on any given year, about 8% of those cases can be directly related to addiction, and that doesn't necessarily capture those sort of situations where there's a number of factors involved, right? When we look at cost, we think it's about $11.8, $12 billion per year lost in our country. And that's a pretty significant chunk of money to think about in terms of the overall cost, not only in terms of economy, but healthcare costs, you know, and obviously that does very little to capture the human cost of addictions. Yeah. And just a fun fact for you, I don't know if you knew this or not, Canada has one of the highest rates of cannabis use in the world. Any questions? Any guesses about who's number one? Because we're not number one. You guys are quiet. Dang. What are the totals? Yes. Yeah, it's the US. US is number one, and last I saw, we're number two. But of course, that's also, especially where things are criminalized based on a lot of self-reporting. But yeah, it was, Maggie. The report I saw was actually pre-legalization. If it's still illegal, it's often about self-reported use and criminal statistics and numbers and stuff like that. Yeah. See, look, fun facts. Everybody's waking up. Yes. Post-lunch sleepiness, we're kicking its butt. All right. I had a big pasta dish for lunch. I shouldn't have had that. Sleepy too. Yeah. So, first things first. I'm going to ask you folks, what is addiction? Dependence on something, dependency, physical or mental, of a substance, perceptions being altered, having to use something over and over to not be able to stop, dependency on the substance, yeah, habit that serves you in some way, something you use to cope. Lots of good ideas here, lots of good choices in terms of wording and in terms of conception. Use to self, a substance that's out of control, bad choice of something which is a waste of our time, right? So when we look at the kind of perception about what addiction is, a lot of it seems to be very specific to substances, which we're going to address a little bit later. But there are a couple of key things I can see there. A few of you mentioned the control factor, which we're going to talk about in a bit. Using something to cope is also something we're going to talk about in a minute. Yeah, someone's saying they can't see all the responses. If you look at your chat box, there's a drop-down menu, and you can choose whether to send it to panelists or to panelists and attendees. So if you're sending it just to panelists, only us as staff can see it. But if you send it to all panelists and attendees, then you can see the responses, which is why I'm reading them out loud. Right. It's a really complex question, right? It's a very difficult question to kind of put a concrete definition to. But ultimately, you know, it does involve the compulsive use of a substance that absolutely impacts a person's ability to function on a day-to-day level. It often happens regardless of the negative consequences or outcomes that it could produce. And this is a long-term, or some people prefer chronic, illness where people have overwhelming needs to give in to specific urges or cravings, despite whatever consequences that may come with that. It's pretty complex, and it's hard to wrap your head around if it's not something you've ever either experienced yourself or perhaps watched a friend or a loved one experience. You know, but it's about much more than just the substance itself. It's not purely caused by a substance. Your lunch could be pasta. Yeah, 100% carbs. Love them. Very close to my heart, unfortunately. You know, so it's not as much as focused on the substance as we used to think. We used to think that the substance was what caused the addiction, and it was all kind of centered around the substance. Now we understand a little bit better that each individual experiences addiction differently based on their own life experiences. And that lived experience helps shape a lot of risk factors that are involved. So it definitely is a very complex process, but we're going to try and help you expand your understanding of it a little bit. Okay. In the end, what I really try to drive home is that this is something that can and does affect anyone, regardless of education, regardless of socioeconomic level, regardless of values, which is a big one people tend to attach to this type of stuff, this illness in particular. So it's really important to realize this is sort of an equal opportunity situation. So Sharon's asking, have studies found that connection or lack of connection is the basis of addictions? There are some, I do know that there are some individual clinicians who would argue that connection or lack of connection is the basis of addictions. And I mean, I've seen the video that circulates on Facebook about it. And what he's referencing, if it's the video you're talking about, the video he's referencing about the study with rats is actually true. The Canadian study actually out in BC. But it's not, this is really very unlikely to be a one trick pony, if I could use that term. But we do know that things like connection are protective factors. It's just that it's not the only protective factor. But that study is absolutely true. Yeah. So let's talk about the spectrum of substance use first and foremost, okay? Because, you know, we tend to talk about addictions in the context of sort of that stigmatized and stereotyped lack of control type situation with really negative consequences. But truthfully, we use substances all the time as human beings, right? And there is such a thing as beneficial substance use, and it all exists on a spectrum or a sliding scale that can be impacted by a lot of different things over time, okay? So what are we talking about when we talk about beneficial use? We can talk about things using substances or engaging in behaviors that are positive for our health, that are positive for our social impacts and connections, or for spiritual uses, right? So for example, medical pharmaceuticals, AKA the stuff your doctor prescribes you, is technically substance use, but because it has a beneficial use for you, we don't tend to look upon it with quite the same lens, right? Coffee and tea contains caffeine, which is technically a substance. And I don't know about you, but I use that particular substance probably a little more than beneficially. You always see studies coming out about, you know, oh, dark chocolate's good for you, or red wine is good for you. And a lot of times what they're trying to speak to is that small to moderate use of certain types of substances can have a benefit for you physically and or mentally. Right? When we talk about spiritual use, there's also things like peyote and stuff like that, where there's a very specific ceremonial or spiritual use or function to a substance. And we consider those to be beneficial as well, because connection to your culture and your spirituality is an important component for a lot of people's overall health and well-being. Right? But if we look at the sliding scale, you know, it can, obviously there's no clear-cut lines here, but there can also be casual and or non-problematic use. And I think, again, most of us can probably relate to this level in some way, shape, or form. So this is use that tends to be recreational, casual, and really doesn't have a whole lot of social or health consequences to it. Something like having 1 or 2 drinks with friends on a Friday night, not really experiencing any form of hangover the next day or negative impacts. And it really kind of facilitated and supported some of that social connection, right? You didn't do anything regrettable, all that good stuff, right? So casual and non-problematic use is again, very common across our culture here in North America. Right? Again, moving along this sort of spectrum, we can see use that's starting to become a bit more problematic. So this is kind of characterized, or this stage or this portion of the spectrum is characterized by uses that begin to have negative consequences for the individual or for family and friends and social connections or for society. And I do underline the or. It doesn't have to be a combination of those things. So one example I use is impaired driving. Right? So I go out and I have 3 drinks and dinner Friday night after work with my coworkers. Legally, I'm over the limit. I probably should not engage in driving, but I choose to do for whatever reason. You know, even if I'm not going to be hungover the next day, even if I'm not engaging in some sort of a chronic dependence, even if, you know, it was a social casual outing, the fact that I'm then engaging or choosing to engage in a consequence that is unhelpful or negative for society, aka drunk driving, that's still problematic use. So it's not always about the amount or the intensity or the duration. Sometimes it's about the choices you make in terms of risk to others as well. Other things that are on the examples list include things like binge consumption, which we hear a lot about in the context of university drinking, right? But we also talk about harmful routes of administration. Do anyone want to take a guess at what that's alluding to? No? No guesses? So we're talking about, in the example section of problematic use, it talks about harmful routes of administration. Does anyone want to take a guess at what that's sort of alluding to or what they mean by that? Yeah, it's headed down that road. So what this is really kind of getting at is what's called harm reduction. So the idea being that anything that reduces harm. So for example, you know, perhaps I use intravenous drugs, but harmful routes of administration could be something like repeatedly using the same needle as opposed to using a clean needle every time. All right. So it's really about, you know, minimizing harm and harm reduction as well. Right. All right. At the far end, we have what's called the chronic dependence aspect of this. And that is sort of what we type, the type of, when we talk about addiction, that's usually what folks kind of go to, right? So it's use that's become habitual, it's become compulsive, and there are negative and social effects, and that use is continuing despite that, like me with pasta. Yeah. Any questions about this spectrum before I move on really quickly? Going once, gone twice, gone. Okay, so really quickly, one of the, aren't some just habits, Sharon? Yeah, when we talk about something that's just a habit, it really would probably land somewhere between casual use and problematic use, depending on the consequences and outcomes, right? But there is really this idea that you can have casual, non-problematic use, like having a glass of wine with dinner, and that's it, you know, those types of things. It's very rare that you'll see really heavy, risky use, and it be just a casual weekend habit. Not saying it doesn't exist, but it not quite as often. Yeah. So when we go about spotting addiction, there's an approach called the 4 C's. So the first C, as you can see, is compulsion, right? And compulsion really talks about the individual's their drive to use a substance, the overwhelming sensation or urge to do so. And when we say compulsions, we truly mean compulsions. Like the individual really may not be able to resist the compulsion itself. Number 2, we see cravings. So those who have addictions tend to crave the substance, and more specifically, the the outcome of the substance. And on top of that, their bodies tend to become physically dependent. And when your body becomes physically dependent, if you try to go without the substance, you can experience what's called withdrawal. So to avoid withdrawal, they'll continue to use the substance and their physical body will crave the substance. Third is loss of control. So this can represent either a loss of control over the frequency, so how often the person is engaging with the substance or behavior, but it can also relate to the amount taken or the length of time. So for example, there's the example in the chat about playing a video game for 10 hours a day. I would be concerned that that volume would be indicative of a loss of control, which could put them in here, right? And every situation is individual. So, we're giving you basic information, but it always exists within an individual's context. Context is really important, right? And continued use despite consequences talks about the idea that the person experiencing the addiction can very much often actually identify that there are negative consequences to what's happening to the behavior, but will be unable to stop or mitigate or change the behavior, certainly not over an extended period of time. Right? So those are your 4 C's. Other symptoms that you can kind of look for with addiction really depend on the substance or behavior and the person. But if we're speaking in generalities here, you can see things like loss of interest, mood swings, impulsivity, problems at home, work, or school, changes in weight, sleep, or eating habits, secrecy, and spotting secrecy is a big one, and denial is a component with almost all types of addiction. For that person, denying the addiction, denying the responsibility of it, denying the consequences of the actions, denying. Right? So again, this isn't a checklist per se, but all things to kind of keep an eye out for. And again, all within the context of that person's life, right, and their experience. I did reference before that addiction can happen to anybody. And we talked a little bit about connection being a protective factor. We do know there's a number of risk factors involved with addiction. Some of these can include things like family history of substance abuse. And that's actually that's one of the biggest risk factors you can kind of attribute out here. In fact, you're actually 6 more times likely to develop an addiction if you have a blood relative who also has addiction. And it's not necessarily substance specific. So let's say I have an aunt who has difficulty with her alcohol use. That doesn't mean that I will also have a problem with alcohol. Perhaps for me, it's something else, right? Marijuana or gaming or something like that. It's more the likelihood of addiction rather than the specific substance. Right? Mental illness can absolutely play a part in your overall risk factors. We're going to talk about that actually a little bit more later on. We'll also talk about the role of stress or the relationship between stress and addiction in a little bit. Substance use beginning at a young age can absolutely be a risk factor because it increases the risk of that use becoming problematic and developing or not developing other coping strategies. We can also see things like gender identity. And this one's twofold. One, statistics tell us that males are twice as likely as women to develop a problematic substance use disorder. And I would argue that there's some reporting discrepancies in there and some gender social issues in terms of what's often talked about. So for women, you'll see higher rates of complaints around mental illness and for men, you'll see higher complaints around things like substance use problems. But I would argue that perhaps there's a little bit of gendered socialization happening there. But that's a soapbox for a different day. Poor home life can also crop up here. Young individuals without strong attachment, which kind of starts to speak to that connection piece we were mentioning earlier, are at heightened risk of experiencing addiction. And we also know that experiences of trauma can play a huge component in development of addictions. In fact, just as there's some clinicians out there who claim that connection or lack of connection is the entire basis of addiction, there are clinicians out there who claim that trauma is quite specifically the entire basis of addiction. I'm less inclined to believe there's one simple, I shouldn't say simple, one answer to all of these things. I'm far more inclined to believe it's that more complex mix of characteristics and life experience and risk factors and protective factors, but there are folks out there that make that argument. And this isn't a be-all end-all list, by the way, folks. This is just sort of some of the big ones we can really highlight. Just trying to keep an eye on my time here. I want to have time for questions after. Please don't forget that the question and answer option is there for you to submit questions. Excuse me. I referenced it really quickly earlier, but a lot of your answers when we talked about what is addiction, a lot of them seem to focus in on substances, but there's actually two really broad categories of addiction, okay? The first one is that substance-related issue that most of you zeroed in on. So problematic use of a substance, it can be drugs, it can be alcohol, it can be almost anything. Excuse me. And the other is actually behavior-related. So a problematic continuation of a specific behavior, including things like binge eating, gambling. Someone mentioned gaming earlier, sex addictions. I've seen exercise being a problematic issue, actually, because we usually think of exercise as kind of a prime example of health-related activities, but anything to an extreme can be problematic. Right? So when we talk about process-related addictions, it tends to be that behavior stuff of like gambling, gaming, those types of things. Social media was mentioned earlier. There's some people arguing that that's going to be a new diagnostic at some point here. It's not currently. And then there's the substance use. Okay. In terms of the commonly misused substances here in Canada, and we're going to go into detail about each of these. There's alcohol, there's cannabis, there's tobacco, and there's prescription drugs. Those are kind of our top four misused substances. And again, we're not zooming in on behavioral or process-based addictions here. We're just talking about substances at this time. So when we talk about alcohol, alcohol is the most commonly used substance in Canada. Canadians spend $15 billion a year on alcohol-related harms. That's about $40 million a day. That's hospital costs, legal costs, policing fees, repairing damage done by intoxication, and taking care of folks' health needs. Right? It's a big cost. Right? And alcohol really is much more of an issue than we tend to realize in Canadian society. In 2016 alone, there were 77,000 hospitalizations that were directly related to alcohol use, while there was only 75,000 hospitalizations for heart attacks. And that's just looking at one area. Right? On average, in Canada, the kids are reporting that they start use of alcohol at 13.5 years old. Here in New Brunswick, 44% of students in grade 7 to 12 report use of alcohol. And again, that's self-reported. Right? There can be lots of negative side effects or outcomes from alcohol use, including things like memory loss, violence, mental health issues, increased risk of some cancers, as well as some of the other health risks involved in terms of its impacts on your body. Right? But ultimately, this is something we tend to have a little more casual attitude towards because it's become quite normalized since prohibition has ended. But there are some very significant impacts socially. Cannabis was the second one I mentioned. And when we talk about cannabis, we know it's the second most commonly used drug-related substance by Canadians. Should not have been that much of a tongue twister. Health Canada claims that 9% of adults and 17% of youth will develop some form of addiction or dependency on cannabis. And it can lead to negative side effects, including memory loss, time distortion, body tremors, increased heart rate, blood pressure, and can act as a risk factor for other illnesses as well, especially depending on how it's consumed. So, for example, if it's vaped, there could be other health-related risks that go along with vaping, whether there's cannabis involved or not. If it's smoked, inhaling any sort of burnt substance isn't good for our body. Our lungs aren't big fans of that. So there's other health risks that can go with it, depending on routes of administration. Any questions about this so far? Are we all still doing okay? Are we all still awake? I feel like I'm testing you now. Hey, we're awake. Okay, cool. Good stuff. What a group. What a group. What a group. Look at you. All right. You're doing better than I am. I'm still sleepy. Let's talk about tobacco, which we referenced as well. And a lot of times we don't necessarily think of smoking when we talk about substance use disorder or addiction. But it's one of the most widely used addictive substances that exists legally in Canada, for sure. It's responsible for just over 17% of all reported deaths, which is kind of terrifying. And as much as we've done in terms of awareness campaigns and educating kids and like the DARE program when I was in school, you know, and stuff like that, you know, there's still over 5 million Canadians that regularly smoke, you know. There's been a question, does education account for addictions? Not on its own. Not on its own. Someone with a very high education or degree of education can experience addictions, you know, and we don't necessarily see, you know, if you're thinking of like lower education, higher accounts of addiction, and then like a slide, it doesn't pan out that way. There's actually a lot of substance use in higher education levels as well. Does that answer the question? Did I understand your question correctly? Nailed it. All right, cool. For example, in St. John, they have the highest reported rate of tobacco use among youth in the province. It's actually quite high. I'm just looking through my notes to see. So 21.6% of all New Brunswick youth in grades 7 through 12 currently smoke tobacco, with the highest rate being in St. John. I mean, at this point, I think we're all pretty aware of the health risks involved with smoking. It's been pounded at us for a number of years now. You know, regular smoking can increase your risk of heart disease, ear and sinus infections, strokes. It can make you more susceptible to colds and flus, can cause digestive issues. It can lead to lung cancer. It's also now considered a leading causation for many other types of cancer, including things like cervical cancer, actually. So there's lots of different risks out there for this. Lots of risks. And prescription drug addiction is the fourth one that we had kind of referenced in that slide that I wanted to talk about today. And Canada has the fourth highest rate of prescription narcotic use in the world. That category includes both pain management medications as well as what are typically called sedatives. Okay. In Canada, 13 hospitalizations are recorded every single day due to illegal use of prescription drugs. In terms of painkillers themselves, painkillers were used by 13% of Canadians in 2017, and it includes multiple families of medications, including Percocet, Tylenol with codeine in it, methadone, fentanyl, oxycodone. There's lots of them out there. Those types of drugs are often prescribed by healthcare professionals to manage pain. But we're seeing a lot come out about prescription habits and usage and monitoring, and this actually being one of the main pathways to opioid addiction is actually through a lot of folks start out with it being prescribed to them, and the addiction develops and worsens as they go along, and they end up taking it without prescription or not as prescribed. The other kind of area we talk about when we talk about prescription drug addiction is sedatives. In terms of how they're or why they're originally prescribed, they're most often prescribed to reduce anxiety and or to help with sleep disturbances. New Brunswick reported one of the highest rates of anti-anxiety medication use in 2007. I'm hoping that has gone down. I know at least several psychiatrists who talk about that they've really cut back on how, when, and why they prescribe certain medications, particularly in this family. So things like Xanax, Valium, and Ativan are all very common sedatives. There's also other benzos, including things like clonazepam, lorazepam, like all those types of things, right? And we do know that the rate of antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication use in Canada has been growing over the past number of years. So those are all kind of pathways towards addiction if they're not monitored and supported appropriately. Okay. All this kind of leads back to some of the original questions you folks were chatting about in the chat box, with the idea of like how do addictions begin, right? People often enjoy the physical and psychological changes that come about from the use of a drug or engaging in a behavior. Humans are very reward-driven animals, and that encourages them to obtain that experience again. Unfortunately, it rarely lives up to how we remember our previous experiences, and it can become a habit, and it can be very difficult to stop. On top of that, there are life events that can happen that can significantly increase our risk for substance use problems. Curiosity is often the thing that kind of opens the door. Impulsivity, or if you're or know someone who is quite impulsive by nature, that can increase risk. Right? Increased stress, can absolutely increase rates of addiction and substance use, generally speaking. In fact, during our current global pandemic, we do know that Canadians are self-reporting higher rates of alcohol and cannabis use, for sure. Trauma, we kind of referenced already, but trauma, and quite specifically, situational things like, you've never had a problem with an addiction before in your past, and then something traumatic happens, and you end up kind of seeking something out to help you cope with that trauma. That often is a pathway. We also see mental illness being a significant connection point, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. there's also social impacts as well. So it's a very complex thing, you know. It's very rare that you can, you know, look at someone's life laid out in front of you and go, ah, there's what caused the addiction. You know, that's very unlikely It's usually a much more complex scenario. Yeah, and in terms of Ativan, I do know at least my psychiatrist has stopped prescribing it, to me at least, specifically because he was concerned about the rates of dependency that were starting to show up with Ativan. But lots of psychiatrists still prescribe it. It's an effective medication. It's just about being aware and mitigating that risk, right? Becky. I don't have any stats on that right now, but if you wanted to email me after, I could try and dig some stuff up for you. I'll type my email in the chat for everybody. So let's talk about mental illness and addiction briefly, okay? We do know that a major health concern in Canada is the co-occurrence of mental health or mental illness issues and addiction. And when we talk about co-occurrence or comorbidity, what we're talking about is both a mental illness and some form of addiction is occurring at the same time. Those with mental illness are twice as likely to experience an addiction. In fact, we do know at this point that about 50% of those who seek help for addiction also have unresolved mental health issues, which serves to further complicate trying to address and meet their needs and help them through what they're experiencing. We also know that there's a higher risk for a number of different subgroups in society, including people who are experiencing socioeconomic concerns, so low income and low opportunity situations, those in a visible minority or racialized individuals, including, you know, Indigenous folks. And we also recognize that members of the queer community and the trans community are often at significantly higher risk for a number of issues related to mental health and addictions. Any questions about that? In the end, you know, it's a very, oftentimes when I speak with folks who experience both addiction and mental illness, they talk about it really kind of being a chicken and egg kind of scenario where, you know, they were struggling, they were engaging in substance use at the same time as the symptoms of their illness were coming out. And they started to figure out that certain substance use could help alleviate certain symptoms. And, you know, it really kind of grew into something much bigger than they ever anticipated, unfortunately. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And I do see a few questions in the Q&A. We're going to get to that, all right? I'm behind, but we're going to get there. Stress and trauma or addiction is one that I referenced already. Abuse, natural disaster, significant financial trouble, criminal victimization, essentially, and other traumatic events can really drive up people's stress level. It can overwhelm their ability to cope or overwhelm the capacity of their normal coping strategies. Oftentimes, we'll try to turn to substances to ease their emotional or physical discomfort, but they end up stuck in a cycle that's really not very fun. Yeah. When we talk about anxiety and addiction, it's often coming down to a self-medicating behavior that turns into a more problematic use. Right? When we talk about folks with anxiety-based disorders, oddly enough, their addiction to stimulants co-occurs 3 times more often in folks with anxiety. Stimulants being stuff that stimulates your central nervous system, so things like caffeine or something harder. People experiencing anxiety are 5 times more likely to experience a substance use disorder, particularly with prescription medications, actually. So a few extra risk factors there. When we talk about depression and addiction, The most commonly used substance by those who experience clinical depression is actually alcohol, which again is maybe perhaps a little unexpected because alcohol is considered a depressant in and of itself. So it suppresses the central nervous system and can actually increase feelings of sadness and isolation, and it can actually perpetuate and feed into the addiction itself. So it becomes very cyclical. People with addiction, with the risk of addiction is twice as likely for individuals who have experience with depression. So lots of risk factors there as well. So how do we help our loved ones? Be reasonably optimistic. And I say reasonably just because we're not aiming for the ostrich head in the sand effect. You know, you need to have a good touch with the reality of the situation, what's going on, but you can still be hopeful and communicate hope and optimism for sure. You can express your concern to your loved ones or your friends or your coworkers, you know, saying, you know, I've noticed X, Y, and Z, and I'm a little concerned, and I want you to know I'm here for you. You know, you can encourage them to seek out help if they're ready for that. So you can say, you know, I've noticed X, Y, and Z, and I'm concerned for your well-being, and I wouldn't want to see this, you know, be something that affects you negatively for a long period of time, you know. And if and when you're ready for help, you know, I'd be more than happy to help you reach out to somebody or something to kind of get that ball rolling. Number 4, set boundaries and stand by them, which is probably the hardest one on this whole list. Anyone who has ever experienced supporting someone who's going through addictions will tell you boundaries can feel like the hardest thing you've ever done, but they're incredibly important to you maintaining your own wellness. So set your boundaries, set your limits, and stick to them. Standing firm is important, you know, and you can be firm while still being compassionate, right? One doesn't exclude the other. But it's very hard to deal with, you know. Don't judge. This is not the time or place to be judgy. So be aware of your comments. Be patient with the person. Try not to fall into nagging, criticizing, or lecturing. Try to avoid labeling a person, like saying, "Oh, you're just an addict." Not helpful, generally speaking. They're experiencing a chronic health concern. They're experiencing a chronic illness, and they need your support and they need your compassion. Addiction is an illness. It's not a choice. It's not a statement of character. It's not a statement of values or morals. It's an illness, and recovery can be possible for those who not only want it, but are ready for it, have the support to be able to access resources, and who put the work in. We're wrapping up here because I want to get to the questions. This is just a little quote at the end, right? So you can't go back and make a new beginning, but you can start today making a new ending. Stay positive, stay focused, and stay strong. In terms of resources, there are a number in this region. Some of the first ones we kind of point folks towards are Portage, which is for youth, anyone below 25, I believe. Narcotics Anonymous runs a hotline, and there is actually a parental gambling hotline. I'm going to hit the chat here in a second in the questions. Hang tight. There's also local mental health professionals, including at your community mental health and addictions clinics. There's one in every region of the province. There's things like peer support consultants. So peer support is really about the idea that who better to understand and empathize and be compassionate with someone going through a specific experience than somebody else who has also gone through that experience. You can access mobile mental health crisis services that are available now in every region of the province. They have different phone numbers and different hours of operation depending on your location, but they do exist. One of the most central places I always send folks is Chimo. Sorry, excuse me. Chimo is 24/7 bilingual provincial hotline. And not only are they great for someone to talk to and some support that way, but they're also really good for resources. So if you're not sure what's available in your area of the province, you can call Chimo at any time and say, I'm looking for resources around substance abuse or addiction in Fredericton. And they actually have a directory of resources available in every region of the province, and they'll freely give that information away. So it's always a central point. Kids helpful, obviously, for anyone 25 and under, I believe, again. Family and friends are probably the most primary source of support an individual can look towards. Because you have your appointment with your counselor, once a month or once every couple of weeks, but your friends and your family are who's there every day. And if it is an emergency, if you're concerned about someone's safety, then 911 or the local hospital is where you need to go. Yeah. So I'm going to hit the chat up here really quickly, see, because I saw there's a couple of things come through. Question, why does it take so long for someone to reach out to a person who is seeking help? So if you're talking about why does it take so long for someone experiencing the addiction to reach out for help, there's lots of factors that go on there. I couldn't even begin to list them all. One, stigma is one of the leading barriers to reaching out for help. The way they're concerned that they will be perceived by others or treated by others because they've reached out for help. It's a big issue. There's also things like not being aware of what services are available to them. There's also a denial or insight component, a self-awareness component that is often a problem or a barrier. It could also be things like logistical, socioeconomic, financial barriers. It's hard to access resources if you don't have a means to access them. And there are some free resources out there, but even something as simple as having childcare or transportation can sometimes be a barrier. So there's lots, and that's not even like there's a whole bunch of different barriers that are out there that really often kind of lead towards those issues. Hopefully that helped answer that question. Yeah, there's still a lot of stigma in society, and it's really unfortunate. Especially when it comes to addictions, even within the medical professions, there's stigma, and it's incredibly disheartening. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you to France for those comments. Yeah. And it kind of goes along with the conversation we're having here. But there are often barriers even within the helping system itself. So for example, a lot of places do not have a concurrent treatment service. So if I have a mental health problem, mental illness, and I have an addiction, they won't even begin to deal with this until they've dealt with this, as opposed to dealing with both of them together because they most likely feed into each other. Right? What's the average time to get help? It depends on the location and it depends on what service you're accessing. I know that here in Fredericton right now, the mental health list, at least, you're looking at 8 to 12 months. In that range. It varies by region and it varies by service you reach out to. So it also depends on your individual situation because they triage folks. So they say they triage you when you come in, much like they do at the ER. And those who are triaged as higher risk, get seen sooner than the folks who are triaged as low risk. Yeah. So if someone already reached out for help, so let's say to a local mental health and addictions clinic, why does the wait so long? Demand, primarily, and funding. I don't know how else to put it. Basically, there are a lot of folks in need of support and services, and it takes a while to work through this stuff. And for caseloads, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Not enough supports and a lot of people needing supports is generally the problem. Is the addiction system overwhelmed? I think that mental health and addiction are significantly underfunded considering the societal impact and demand placed on those systems. I do think that, we're asking an awful lot of the folks on the front line with, very little support or assistance. But there is capacity there, and there is community capacity. So, for example, I know that detox in Moncton is often very busy. However, there's a number of community-based services that do not offer the exact same thing, but will help you with other areas while you're waiting for a better detox. And I think some reorganization could also go a long way. How big is New Brunswick's mental health department? I do not have the answer to that question. I won't lie to you. I can tell you that it depends on what you're looking at, because there's also different layers to that as well, right? Like, a lot of folks are waiting significant periods of time for things like access to a psychiatrist, but access to something like a registered social worker who can help you with some coping strategies is much faster. So that's often what's going on there. But I really don't have a specific number for you on how big that mental health department is overall. There's also 2 health authorities, don't forget. So you would need to kind of take that into account. Yeah. Holy moly, I'm never going to catch up. Okay, I'm going to check the question and answer section. And then I'll come back to the chat. So if anybody had to leave and they had a question, I'll always get that answered. Sorry, team. If someone is recovering, do they still suffer damage from abuse? Okay, so this question is about, let's say someone experiences substance use addiction early on in life, but manages to find their way into recovery and stays in recovery for, a long period of time, like let's say 30 years. Do they still suffer damage from earlier abuse? Physically, I know that some damage does remain. I do know the body is incredible at healing damage. So, for example, the lungs of somebody who smokes currently versus who stopped 3 months ago versus who stopped 5 years ago. It's incredible to see the regenerative ability of our body. But those things will always, it's not to say it'll ever go back to the way it was or would have been without that damage in the first place. And the other aspect is the addictive personality. And it's not a personality characteristic. It really is an illness and a developed coping strategy and pathway in the brain. So yes, essentially. Most folks I work with at least report that some remnants of those old thinking patterns, of those old urges, those old types and ways of thinking, they always kind of carry with them. It can become those can become quite quieted over time, but they're still there usually. Yeah. So we did that one. Edible cannabis products. I'm not sure what we want to talk about with that. I do have, maybe if you can be more specific. edible cannabis products are now available through Cannabis NB. There's things like beverages, chocolates, gummies, oils, and capsules, I believe. There is extra warning around them because the route of administration is very different than smoking or vaping, in that it takes longer to take effect. So instead of getting a very sharp increase in effect and then going down, you tend to get more of a flattened curve of impact. I'm not sure what else you're looking to know about that. Maybe if you have a more specific question around edibles. There's lots of folks who will say it's not possible to become addicted to cannabis. I do see a lot of education campaigns trying to address the fact that long-standing rumor is out there. You can become addicted to cannabis. Physical dependence to a point of withdrawal is not always what we're talking about when we talk about addiction, though. There's something called psychological dependence or addiction. And frequently that's a big chunk of the impacts of the cannabis addiction, but it can be physiological as well. And there are education campaigns out there. It's just a matter of I think Canada's trying to figure out how to have those conversations effectively. And I do think we will learn and we will get there. It just takes time. People forget that after Prohibition, there was a big learning curve societally there as well. Setting boundaries. Okay. Setting boundaries is something that's really personal between you and the person you have a relationship with who's experiencing addictions. So I'm not sure I can really get too concrete. What I can tell you is that it's one of the biggest things family members and friends seem to struggle with. It's very emotional. It's very difficult. Oftentimes it's things like having to ask the person to, for example, for myself, I was trying to support somebody at one point who was experiencing addiction, and I set out clear rules about if they were going to come live with me. I was willing to do that, but there were some clear rules I wanted in place about that. And if those rules couldn't be followed, then they could not stay with us. So I'd set those boundaries in place. There have been multiple discussions about it. It was a younger person, so there was a lot of talking and trying to get some learning happening as well. But eventually the boundary violations were consistent enough that I did have to ask that person to no longer live at our house. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I had to do it twice, actually. Because you know that person's circumstance, that their options are limited. But by the same token, you need to respect the boundaries you set and what is going to keep you well enough to continue to be in a position to support them when they're ready for that help. If you're struggling with boundaries or you're looking for more information on boundaries, that's one of those things that if you're in the position where you're having to set boundaries and stuff like that, one of the best things you can do for yourself is get support for yourself, because it's a hard, long learning process. We have some groups on the go that kind of address that or help support that learning, including one called Engaging Families in Recovery and one called D2R, Dependency to Recovery. They're both fantastic programs that we offer virtually. That would start that conversation a bit more. And in the end, you can always reach out to things like EAP for specific coaching and support about boundary setting. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the Q&As. Headed back to the chat. Here. rehab beds. Yeah, there's a big gap that happens. So someone's saying it's hard to get help after 21. And it depends on the mental health system and the addiction system. But generally speaking, when you turn 18, 19, and it's okay for anyone that had to go. I'm sorry, I'm just answering questions. It's all good. You know, there's a shift from the youth system to the adult system. There's a lot of gaps that happen in there. Portage is a private facility, so they set their line at 21. Mistrust in systems. Yeah. Previous negative experiences, absolutely. How can we help with funding? No. You have time and desire. That's awesome. There's local nonprofits in every region of this province that would be more than happy to get some support and some assistance. Either us provincially or another one in your area. If you reach out to almost any community organization or nonprofit and say, I'd like to give my time and energy, they'll be very excited to hear from you. Yeah, that's cool. So some places set up, you know, mental health, self-help groups, Facebook groups, resource pages, and things like that. Yeah. And again, folks, you know, if you're all with GNB, then, you know, you've got a 100-page PDF that's called the Mental Health Toolkit. You've got EAP, you've got benefits. Those are all great places to head to. Some references about podcasts. If you refer yourself to mental health, is it much faster intake than if you wait for a doctor? No. Whether you're referred by your doctor, whether you self-refer, they will intake, do an assessment, triage you, and you'll basically be on the list. And you got to keep them updated. Yeah. As far as I know, 211 is connected to some basic mental health information. I'm not sure that they have the extensive level of information that someone like Chimo has just yet, but it's a new service, so it's going to take time to kind of grow. Yeah. All I can say is if you're waiting for services, be persistent, be the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. Keep them up to date about any situational changes, because they need to know that stuff to be able to make sure that they have you triaged on the right place. 211. Yeah, so good self-care. The mental health toolkit. The mental health toolkit was blasted out to every single GNB employee at least once, if not twice, last year. It might also be on your intranet. I do have a copy of it on my desktop, though it might be out of date, because I think I saved it a year and a half ago, but I can send you that if you want. If you want to email me, just tell me what, say, you know, I'm looking for the mental health toolkit for GNB. I'll attach the PDF for you, but I think it's on your intranet as well. It was done by Finance Treasury Board, is who put that out. Generally speaking, the John Howard Society is one of the only places that will specifically service folks who have been involved with the criminal justice system. That's not to say that someone who's been involved with the criminal justice system can't access other public services. They certainly can. It's just that the John Howard is kind of that's kind of their jam. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? All right, folks. I want to thank you very much for coming and hanging out today. I really enjoyed getting to chat with you all. I haven't seen too many friendly faces and have had so many chats as with COVID. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that today. Like I said, please reach out to us if you have any questions. I put my email in the chat, or you can get it on social media, or info.cmhanb.ca is our kind of generic email. So there's lots of ways to get a hold of us, and we'd love to hear from you if there's anything we can do to support you with. There's an evaluation at the end of this today. If you could do that, that would be awesome. and hopefully everybody has a great rest of their afternoon.